The scheme in New Orleans involved a child prostitution service which catered to congressmen, senators, and the extremely wealthy. There was no camp or farm. The operation had no name. It drew its victims from the foster care system, churches, and a fully accredited alternative learning school with multiple locations in Florida. There are many unanswered questions in this part of our story. The reason for this comes from a troubling lack of investigation by the prosecutor's office in New Orleans, the death of a young witness in Florida, and what appears to be an organized effort to cover up the true extent of the crimes. Unfortunately, pictures of the convicted are scarce. As a result, we were forced to use avatars in place of actual photographs. In the early 1970s, Richard Halverson and Raymond Woodall were listed as maintenance men for the Adelphi academies in the state of Florida. Adelphi had two locations, one in Dade County and one in Tampa. Another man affiliated with the school and living in Florida was a bachelor named Robert Lang. Both Lang and Halverson were registered as foster parents in Florida. Lang worked for the post office, and his records indicated that he had previously been a police officer in Oregon. Halverson, a divorced father of one, was college educated and worked as a photographer and sound engineer. School principal and co-owner of the Adelphi Academies was another single man named Peter Bradford. In 1973, the 47-year-old Richard Halverson returned to New Orleans. He enlisted the help of a 41-year-old man named Richard Pass. Newspaper accounts do not list Richard Pass' profession. The two men joined charity organizations and volunteered to help troubled boys. Halverson became a volunteer probation officer. In this capacity, he could easily identify boys who had no father present in the home. Using state records, Halverson and Pass began recruiting their victims. The men began by ingratiating themselves with single mothers. A favorite tactic was to give the boys expensive presents the women could not afford. Soon, Ray Woodall and his boyfriend, Louis Seau, joined Halverson and Pass to form a male escort service. Woodall also enlisted the help of one of his victims, a kid from South Carolina named Harry Kramer. Still in his teens when he began working with the men, Kramer had now turned child abuser, molesting boys as young as 8. The new escort service offered adult male prostitutes, as well as boys. The adults were recruited by placing ads in local newspapers. The tour guide service offered its customers a guide for $500. This price included transportation to the New Orleans International Airport, hotel stay, meals, and the sexual services of said guide. It is not known how much the men charged for minors, but we do know from a state's witness that the boys were paid about $50 for each customer. In short order, the escort service focused primarily on offering young boys. Always searching for more victims, the men worked tirelessly devising new schemes in which they could recruit children. Raymond Woodall lived with his mother in New Orleans East, which at that time was a middle-class neighborhood. One day, while delivering clothes to the poor through their church, Woodall and his mother arrived at a house occupied by a single mother with 7 children. Woodall took a liking to her 8-year-old son. He asked the woman to let the boy come live with him, assuring her that he and his mother could properly care for the child. The woman agreed. The boy was given his own room at Woodall's mother's house. His sexual abuse began the very day he arrived. Another member of the pedophile ring was a New Orleans artist named John Reed Campbell. Mr. Campbell joined Halverson and Woodall in a scheme to lure boys into a public park. Halverson placed ads in the local newspaper which read, "Seeking young models to pose for fishing pictures in City Park. Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer types wanted. Pays $5 bonuses." By now, Halverson had legally gained custody of 2 foster boys, which he brought along to assist in recruiting new victims in the park. Woodall brought his newly acquired 8-year-old. In the spring of 1974, the men decided to start their own Boy Scout troop, through a local Presbyterian church attended by Ray Woodall. At the New Orleans church, Woodall led the effort to organize the troop. The local Boy Scouts Council investigated Woodall and voted against him being appointed as scoutmaster. The pastor and an institutional representative overrode the objection, and Woodall was made scoutmaster. After this, Raymond Woodall immediately brought in Robert Lang to serve as a committee member for the troop. With concern still lingering, Halverson was suggested to replace Woodall as the troop's scoutmaster. After an extensive background check, the Boy Scout Council felt comfortable with Richard Halverson taking over. The council had no reason not to. Through his volunteer work, Halverson had developed excellent working relationships with the courts, police, and social workers. Halverson came with many credible recommendations. One event in particular offers an example of just how good Halverson was at his deception. In the mid-1970s, police and social services in Florida began investigating complaints that a foster parent named John Douglas was molesting young boys in his care. Several victims had been interviewed by police. Detectives found Richard Halverson's name listed as a reference in Mr. Douglas's paperwork. After running a background check on Halverson, detectives contacted him in New Orleans to inquire about John Douglas. Halverson told police this type of accusation sometimes happens when working with troubled youth. Halverson stated he knew for certain that Mr. Douglas was not the kind of man who would sexually abuse children. What Florida police and social workers did not realize was that Richard Halverson and John Douglas were the same man. Halverson had in fact successfully registered as a foster parent in Florida under this alias. The Boy Scout troop Halverson now ran in New Orleans never grew very large. News reports offer conflicting numbers. Some report 18 members, others say 30. What we can confirm is that the only members of Troop 137 who reported sexual abuse were already living with members of the sex ring before the troop was even established. The escort service routinely brought children across Lake Pontchartrain to private estates for sex parties. The boys were also brought to private residences in New Orleans and Jefferson Parish. Single men bringing half a dozen boys to the private home of another single man, many times staying after dark, would certainly bring unwanted scrutiny from observant neighbors. If, however, the boys were dressed in Boy Scout uniforms, people thought their neighbor to be a charitable citizen. Everyone knows that Boy Scouts go on organized trips with vetted chaperones, and their parents know exactly where they are. Halverson's tour guide service simply ordered an assortment of uniforms and dressed all of their victims in them, almost none actually being Boy Scout members. If police should ever have any questions, as long as Halverson, Lang, or Woodall were present, that would be the end of it. A 35-year-old man named Nelson Bone offers us an example as to how this tactic was employed. Bone owned a home in an upper-middle-class neighborhood. The boys were brought over on several occasions, arriving in Boy Scout uniforms for his naked pool parties. Mr. Bone also developed home movies for the members of the escort service. In 1975, Richard Halverson began recruiting children to send to the Adelphi Academy, where his friend Peter Bradford remained principal. Using state records, Halverson matched boys with his list of criteria. The potential victims must be poor, no father present in the home, failing grades, or having truancy issues. One by one, Halverson appeared at the door of single mothers' homes, many of whom he was already acquainted with. Using his state credentials as a juvenile probation officer, Richard Halverson offered a fantastic opportunity for these boys. The Adelphi Academy was a fully accredited institution which offered a special program for troubled youth. Best of all, Halverson could obtain a scholarship for the boys. Even transportation to Florida was covered. In fact, the entire program, including room and board, was offered to qualified recipients at no cost. After visiting the homes of his potential victims, Halverson organized a reception for any interested parents to attend. Peter Bradford arrived from Florida and made a presentation about the academy and answered any questions the parents had. While in New Orleans, Bradford molested 2 boys supplied to him by the tour guide service. A few days later, Principal Bradford flew out of New Orleans with 6 boys, paying for all the tickets himself. Once in Florida, all the boys stayed in Principal Bradford's private home. While attending his academy, they were watched at all times. Their phone calls were monitored. The boys suffered sexual and physical abuse on a daily basis, as well as witnessing other students suffer the same fate. Back in New Orleans, Ray Woodall's victim Harry Kramer, now turned sex offender, was often enlisted to photograph the tour guide service abuse of boys. In midsummer of 1976, Kramer was sent to have photographs developed. The tour guide service used large commercial development companies to develop their pictures. These companies use an automated system to develop high volumes of photographs. Employees never actually saw the pictures they were developing. That is, unless the machine jammed, which is exactly what happened with Kramer's photos. Upon seeing the escort service's pictures, a horrified employee immediately called the police. The photographs implicated numerous members of the tour guide service. This gave detectives a golden opportunity to catch the group unaware. Based solely on the pictures turned in from the photomat, New Orleans police were granted search warrants. On September 10, 1976, police executed 3 pre-dawn raids. The material seized was more graphic and abhorrent than anything previously confiscated in the New Orleans Police Department's history. This claim was not a ploy to sell newspapers. The photos were genuinely violent and extremely disturbing to anyone who viewed them. Along with boxes of child pornography, files were found with names and addresses of the tour guide service's customers. Pornography filmed at Father Bud's, along with his name and address, were found. Detectives phoned Tennessee, and the local prosecutor's office immediately began their case. In one house, police found letters from men looking for sex with boys dating back to 1956. Richard Halverson was arrested inside his home during the search. Ray Woodall was arrested inside his mother's home. The third search was of John Reed Campbell's house, located at 7936 West Laverne Street. Police confiscated pictures, slides, magazines, books, and letters. Unlike Halverson and Woodall, Mr. Campbell was not arrested. Shortly after dawn, Campbell walked into the Orleans Parish Prosecutor's office, where he had a private, closed-door meeting with District Attorney Harry Connick and an assistant prosecutor. 2 days later, John Reed Campbell fled New Orleans. Not long after these pre-dawn raids, the 6 boys from New Orleans were abruptly returned home from the Adelphi Academy in Florida. Now aged 11 and 13, 2 of the boys told their mother what had happened to them. The woman went to New Orleans police with a list of names for detectives to investigate, as well as the Adelphi Academy itself. The oldest boy sat down with detectives and helped to identify more of the culprits. New Orleans detectives believed his story about the Florida school and phoned police in Coral Gables. 2 Florida detectives boarded a plane for New Orleans the same day. As the detectives were en route to Louisiana, Florida police were sent to the Adelphi Academy, as well as Principal Bradford's home. Peter Bradford had already vanished. While Florida detectives were in New Orleans, the 13-year-old victim gave them the names of other boys from the Adelphi school. After reviewing all of the evidence seized by New Orleans police, the detectives returned to Florida to find Peter Bradford and build a case against him. They eventually found one of the victims described to them by the boy in New Orleans. When talking to detectives in Florida, this young man's description of the abuse suffered at the Adelphi Academy exactly matched the 2-page written statement from the New Orleans victim. The victim in Florida had now turned 16. He had a girlfriend and a full-time job. The boy had never been in trouble with the law, even after his ordeal. Skipping school and curfew violations was what landed him in the Adelphi Academy. Florida detectives learned that their witness had also been molested by a former military officer and CIA employee. The man was a wealthy resident of Coral Gables. After learning of the man's credentials, detectives gave the young victim a polygraph test, which he passed. Next, a grand jury was convened. Before the victim had a chance to testify, he was found dead. A stripped electrical cord had been taped to his heart. The local coroner ruled his death a suicide. His demise collapsed the Florida investigation, and no one was ever prosecuted. Back in Louisiana, in April of 1977, Richard Halverson was convicted for his involvement in the tour guide service. One final note about Richard Halverson. During their investigation, detectives learned that Halverson had submitted his paperwork to the state of Louisiana to create a boys' home through Francis Sheldon's Church of the New Revelation. Raymond Woodall was sentenced to 75 years. Harry Kramer received 45 years. And Richard Pass received 40 years. Nelson Bone, who threw the naked pool parties, received 25 years. Mystery man Robert E. Lang, if that was even his real name, had a New Orleans address when arrested in Louisiana. Detectives in Florida found documentation and photographs establishing that Mr. Lang had served in all 4 major branches of the U.S. military, which is effectively impossible. It is unclear if he ever faced charges in Florida. He pled guilty to his charges involving the tour guide service in New Orleans and received probation. He is the only man convicted in this case who was not handed a prison sentence. Clients of the tour guide service were given lengthy prison sentences as well. First was a man named Larry Joe Phillips. Mr. Phillips was out on bail when he was arrested in Louisiana. Before arriving in Louisiana, the 36-year-old hospital technician had been charged with molesting a 13- and a 15-year-old boy just east of Tallahassee. The 15-year-old Florida boy's case never went to trial. Phillips was convicted of molesting a 13-year-old, but was allowed to walk out of jail after posting a $50,000 bond until his appeal was heard. After being fired from the county hospital in Florida, Phillips had moved to Shreveport, where he was hired by another hospital. At the time of his arrest in Louisiana, Mr. Phillips was routinely making the 600-mile round trip to New Orleans to use the tour guide service. After his New Orleans trial, Larry Joe Phillips received 30 years. At his sentencing, Judge Frank A. Marullo, Jr. told Phillips, "You were found guilty of violating a child. You are the worst kind of human being walking this earth." Another customer was 45-year-old California millionaire Robert B. Mallers. Mr. Mallers was convicted of molesting a 9-year-old boy on several occasions inside the private home of Richard Halverson. Mr. Mallers' charges predated the formation of Boy Scout Troop 137. He received 9 years. At least 2 more millionaire customers were arrested. Richard C. Jacobs and Hugh Scott Meller. The 54-year-old Meller was owner and president of Reservoir Regra, Incorporated, a real estate holding company in Massachusetts. Mr. Meller was arrested in Boston and sent back to New Orleans to face charges of molesting a 13-year-old boy the tour guide service delivered to his door at the French Quarter Holiday Inn. Meller's sentencing was delayed after a judge accused him of trying to bribe his way out of the charges. This was never proven, however, and Meller was sentenced to only 5 years in Angola State Penitentiary. Of all the tour guide service customers to be arrested, 41-year-old Richard C. Jacobs racked up the most charges, 15 in all. Jacobs was president of a global business named Jet Spray Cooler Incorporated, a company he inherited from his father. The corporate office was located in Brookline, Massachusetts. Several newspapers indicated he was co-owner of the New England Patriots. Mr. Jacobs had previously jumped bail on child sex charges in London. Even so, on May 10, 1977, Richard C. Jacobs walked out of the Orleans Parish prison with two of the best attorneys money could buy. They had won him a $50,000 bail. To the surprise of no one, Jacobs was never seen again. Mr. Jacobs' story doesn't end that day, however. His brother Leonard Jacobs and mother Ruth Goldstein Jacobs actually attempted to collect on Richard's $1 million life insurance policy. A judge finally had to declare Richard still among the living to end the fiasco in Massachusetts. In July of 1977, John Reed Campbell finally had charges filed against him: aggravated rape and aggravated crime against nature. These are the same charges Richard Halverson and Ray Woodall received back in 1976, after all three of the men's homes had been raided. On November 25, 1979, the Times-Picayune breaks the story about the tour guide service. Until the Picayune story, the entire country believed the incident revolved around a Boy Scout troop. This was in no small part due to District Attorney Harry Connick constantly mentioning the Boy Scouts at press conferences. Not mentioned by Connick was an offshore oil worker named Dale Edmonds. Mr. Edmonds had been arrested at the same time as many of the men. Edmonds was an active member of Big Brothers. Although he was facing 7 counts for molesting 2 14-year-old boys, the district attorney's office kept Big Brother's name out of their press statements. The Times-Picayune story broke after Raymond Woodall wrote a letter describing how the tour guide service worked and who some of its clients were. The public learned for the first time that several congressmen and one senator had been accused of using the service. Woodall claimed that almost the entire hierarchy of one state, as far as the top political posts, were involved. Because of the Picayune story, D.A. Connick was forced to admit he knew about the tour guide service. The official statement from the New Orleans authorities read, "There was no cover-up or anything like that. We weren't able to develop the evidence to pursue it." And of course, once again, the Boy Scouts are mentioned. In February, 2.5 years after Campbell's house had been raided, District Attorney Harry Connick requests assistance from the FBI in locating John Reed Campbell. In fact, formal charges against Campbell had not been filed until July 13, 1977, a year after his house was raided, where police confiscated pictures, slides, magazines, books, and letters pertaining to sex acts between young boys and adult males. On Tuesday, March 4th of 1980, Larry Joe Phillips, the previously convicted hospital technician from Florida, had an appeal hearing. Louis Seau was brought in to testify. Seau had made a deal with prosecutors for consideration of leniency in exchange for his testimony in the numerous trials. In 1980, he was still testifying as part of this agreement. Seau's statements in court that day put District Attorney Connick back on the front pages. During questioning, Seau testified that early in the investigation, Connick and New Orleans police had shown him photographs of their suspects. He testified that some of the pictures were of John Reed Campbell. He told the court, "I knew that Harry Connick was involved with John Campbell as his lover, and there was a cover-up." At this point, Seau had already received an extremely light 7-year sentence for his involvement. What is hard to understand is why a man in Seau's position would lie in his current predicament. His statements in court guaranteed he would have prosecutors argue against his parole. The day after Seau's testimony, Connick gave a prepared statement to the press, who, as you might imagine, were eager to hear from him. "The charges made in court against me by convicted felon Louis Seau are lies plain and simple. What is so hard to understand is how anyone can give credence to the statements of that nature by someone like Seow. Of course, District Attorney Connick had asked quite a few judges and jurors to give credence to Mr. Seow's statements of that nature over the last 3 years. Next, Connick told the press, "It is a case of vengeance by a desperate criminal." Mr. Seow's boyfriend and partner in crime, Raymond Woodall, had received a 75-year sentence. Had Louis Seow's 7-year sentence rendered him desperate? His sentence was equal to the millionaire customers convicted in the case, who had the best attorneys money could buy. Things only got worse for Connick. He was forced to admit that John Reed Campbell had previously helped with his election campaign, but he insisted that the two were not friends. Connick told reporters, "As long as I'm a district attorney, I'll never stop prosecuting the Louis Seows and Larry Joe Phillips of this world. I'll never stop trying to take the sex offenders and the child molesters off the streets and put them behind bars." On April 6, 1980, District Attorney Connick had a subpoena served on Ed Tunstall, chief editor of the Times-Picayune. Harry Connick had convened a grand jury and was now demanding all records the newspaper had on John Reed Campbell. On May 7th, only 2 months after Connick declared he would never stop trying to take child molesters off the streets, and 3 months after he had asked the FBI to help find Campbell, the charge of conspiracy to commit aggravated rape against John Reed Campbell were dropped by the New Orleans prosecutor's office. Campbell still had charges pending, however. Let's take a look at this Associated Press article from July 23, 1982, just 2 years after District Attorney Harry Connick's Tough on Crime speech. Incredibly, Connick's office now claims John Reed Campbell's case has grown stale. In fact, the district attorney was now dropping all remaining charges against Campbell. And what must have been sheer coincidence, Harry Connick was out of town. Instead, the public hears the news from an assistant district attorney. The 6-year period has clouded a lot of our witnesses' memories. They all have become unsure over the years as to what actually happened. We felt like we're not able to prove what is a very difficult burden in any case beyond a reasonable doubt. Apparently, Connick's office had an entirely different set of victims and witnesses for the remaining cases of men who still had active warrants issued against them. 4 cases stemming from the tour guide service remained open. No charges had been dropped against any of the other men. John Reed Campbell was in court with the assistant prosecutor that day. He said nothing as he brushed by reporters. One final note for this episode. The Adelphi Academy student, who was found dead with an electrical cord taped to his body, was named Scott Baker. In 1977, the Chicago Tribune reported that police had declared the Adelphi Academy a prostitution front. By then, it had been sold to an unsuspecting buyer. Yet before the school changed owners, the Adelphi Academy had at least one other student who met an early demise, a senior named Amy Billig. The last people to see Amy Billig alive were the students and staff of the Adelphi Academy. Amy walked out of Adelphi at lunchtime, called her father on the telephone, and was never seen again. A number of people came forward claiming they had seen a young female matching Billig's description hitchhiking after her disappearance. Her mother now believes that Amy was murdered, although her body has never been found. Amy Billig graduated from the Adelphi Academy of Coral Gables in absentia in April of 1974. Her parents were presented with a diploma. 1974 is also the year which multiple newspapers have confirmed that Halverson and Woodall were listed as maintenance men at the Adelphi Academy. As for Principal Bradford, in 1977, Florida detectives watched the home of one of his victims, who had just moved to Daytona Beach. Sure enough, Principal Bradford showed up. He was arrested with $10,000 in cash and traveler's checks, which would be the equivalent of $44,000 today. Bradford was sent to New Orleans, where a judge gave him $50,000 bail. To the surprise of no one, Principal Bradford disappeared once again. Bradford was a naturalized citizen. His real name was Peter Mueller. In the next episode, we will examine the mastermind of an international child prostitution scheme, a man named John Norman. Just as with Father Budd, Mr. Norman's name and information was found during the raids on Richard Halverson, Raymond Woodall, and John Reed Campbell.